5. Raju welcomed the intrusion, something to relieve the loneliness of the place. R.K. Narayan. It is possible to appreciate the importance of space in the Navidson record without first taking into account the significance of echoes. However, before even beginning a cursory examination of their literal and thematic presence in the film, echoes reverberating within the word itself need to be distinguished. Generally speaking, echo has two coextensive histories, the mythological one and the scientific one. Note: David Eric Katz argues for a third, the epistemological one. Of course, the implication that the current categories of myth and science ignore the reverberation of knowledge itself is not true. Katz's treatment of repetition, however, is still highly rewarding. His list of examples in Table 3 are particularly impressive. See The Third Beside You, an analysis of the epistemological echo by David Eric Katz, Oxford University Press, 1982. End note. Each provides a slightly different perspective on the inherent meaning of recurrence, especially when that repetition is imperfect. To illustrate the multiple resonances found in an echo, the Greeks conjured up the story of a beautiful mountain nymph. Her name was Echo, and she made the mistake of helping Zeus succeed in one of his sexual conquests. Hera found out and punished Echo, making it impossible for her to say anything except the last words spoken to her. Soon after, Echo fell in love with Narcissus, whose obsession with himself caused her to pine away until only her voice remained. Another lesser-known version of this myth has Pan falling in love with Echo. Echo, however, rejects his amorous offers, and Pan, being the god of civility and restraint, tears her to Pisces, burying all of her except her voice. Adontata mel. Note: Adontata equals her still singing limbs. Subnote: Note that luckily in this chapter, Zampano penciled many of the translations for these Greek and Latin quotations into the margins. I've gone ahead and turned them into footnotes. End subnote, end note. In both cases, unfulfilled love results in the total negation of Echo's body and the near negation of her voice. Note: Ivan Largos Stilets, Greek Mythology Again, Boston, Billiquist Press, 1995, pages 343 to 497, as well as Ovid's Metamorphoses, 3, 356 to 410. End note. But Echo is an insurgent. Despite the divine constraints imposed upon her, she still manages to subvert the god's ruling. After all, her repetitions are far from digital, much closer to analog. Echo colors the words with faint traces of sorrow, the Narcissus myth, or accusation, the Pan myth, never present in the original. As Ovid recognized in his Metamorphoses, Spreta latet silvis, pudibundaque frondibus ora protegit, et solis ex illo vivit in antris, sed tamen heret amor, crescitque dolore repulsae, extenuant vigiles corpus, miserabile cure adductique cutem, masis et in era succus corporis omnis abit, vox tantum atque ossa supersunt, vox manet ossa ferunt lapidis traxisse figuram inde latet silvis, nulloque in monte videtur, omnibus auditor, sonus est, qui vivit in illa. Note: eloquently translated by Horace Gregory as, so she was turned away, to hide her face, her lips, her guilt among the trees, even their leaves, to haunt caves of the forest, to feed her love on melancholy sorrow, which, sleepless, turned her body to a shade, first pale and wrinkled, then a sheet of air, then bones, which some say turned to thin worn rocks, and last her voice remained, vanished in forest. Far from her usual walks on hills and valleys, she's heard by all who call, her voice has life. The Metamorphoses by Ovid, New York, A Mentor Book, 1958, page 97. Endnote. To repeat, her voice has life. It possesses a quality not present in the original, revealing how a nymph can return a different and more meaningful story in spite of telling the same story. Note: literary marvel Miguel de Cervantes set down this compelling passage in his Don Quixote, Part 1, Chapter 9. La verdad, cuya madre es la historia, émula del tiempo, depósito de las acciones, testigo de lo pasado, ejemplo y aviso de lo presente, advertencia de lo porvenir. Subnote, which Anthony Bonner translates as truth, whose mother is history, who is the rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, example and lesson to the present, and warning to the future. Editors. End subnote. Much later, a yet untried disciple of arms had the rare pleasure of meeting the extraordinary Pierre Menard in a Paris café following the Second World War. Reportedly, Menard expounded on his distinct distaste for madeleines, but never mentioned the passage and echo of Don Quixote he had penned before the war, which had subsequently earned him a fair amount of literary fame. La verdad, cuya madre es la historia, émula del tiempo, depósito de las acciones, testigo de lo pasado, ejemplo y aviso de lo presente, advertencia de lo porvenir. This exquisite variation on the passage by the ingenious layman is far too dense to unpack here. Suffice it to say, Menard's nuances are so fine they are nearly undetectable, though talk with the framer, and you will immediately see how haunted they are by sorrow, accusation, and sarcasm. Subnote. Exactly. How the fuck do you write about exquisite variation when both passages are exactly the same? I'm sure the late hour has helped. Add to that the dim light of my room, or how poorly I've been sleeping. Going to sleep, but not really resting, if that's possible. Though let me tell you, sitting alone, awake to nothing else but this odd murmuring, like listening to the penitent pray. You know it's a prayer, but you miss the words. Or, better yet, listening to a bitter curse, realizing a whole lot wrongs being ushered into the world, but still missing the words. Me like that, listening in my way by comparing in his way both Spanish fragments, both written out on brown leaves of paper. Or no, that's not right, not brown. More like, I don't know. Yes, brown, but in the failing light appearing almost colored, or the memory of a color. Somehow violent, or close to that. Or not at all. As I just keep reading both pieces over and over again, trying to detect at least one differing accent or letter. Wanting to detect at least one differing accent or letter. Getting almost desperate in that pursuit, only to reportedly discover perfect similitude. Though how can that be, right? If it were perfect, it wouldn't be similar. It would be identical. And you know what? I've lost this sentence. I can't even finish it. Don't know how. Here's my point. The more I focused in on the words, the farther I seemed from my room. No sense where, either, until all of a sudden, along the edges of my tongue, towards the back of my mouth, I started to taste something extremely bitter, almost metallic. I began to gag. I didn't gag, but I was certain I would. Then I got a whiff of that same something awful I detected outside of the shop in the hall. Faint as hell at first, until I knew I'd smelled it, and then it wasn't faint at all. A whole lot of rot was suddenly packed up my nose, slowly creeping down my throat, closing it off. I started to throw up, watery chunks of vomit flying everywhere, sluicing out of me onto the floor, splashing onto the wall, even onto this. Except I only coughed. I didn't cough. I lightly cleared my throat, and then the smell was gone, and so was the taste. I was back in my room again, looking around in the dim light, jittery, disoriented, but hardly fooled. I put the fragments back in the trunk, walked the perimeter of my room, glass of bourbon, a toke on a blunt. There we go. Bring on the haze. But who am I kidding? I can still see what's happening. My line of defense has not only failed, it failed long ago. Don't ask me to define the line either, or why exactly it's needed, or even what it stands in defense against. I haven't the foggiest idea. This much, though, I'm sure of. I'm alone in hostile territories with no clue why they're hostile or how to get back to safe havens. An old haven, a lost haven, the temperature dropping, the hour heaving and pitching towards a profound darkness, while before me my idiotic, amorotic guide laughs, actually cackles is more like it, lost in his own litany of inside jokes, completely out of his head, out of focus too, zonules of Zinn, among other things, having snapped long ago like piano wires, leaving me with absolutely no sound way to determine where the hell I'm going, though right now, going to hell seems like a pretty sound bet. End subnote. End note. In his own befuddled way, John Hollander has given the world a beautiful and strange reflection on love and longing. To read his marvelous dialogue on Echo, note. See John Hollander's The Figure of Echo, Berkeley, University of California Press, 1981. End note. Is to find its author standing perfectly still in the middle of the sidewalk, eyes wild with a cascade of internal reckonings, lips acting out some unintelligible discourse, inaudible to the numerous students who race by him, noting his mad appearance and, quite rightly, offering him a wide berth as they escape into someone else's class. Note. Kelly Chiamotto makes mention of Hollander in her essay Mid-Sentence, Midstream, in Glorious Garrulous Graphomania, ed. T.N. Joseph Truslow, Iowa City, University of Iowa Press, 1989, page 345. End note. Hollander begins with a virtual catalogue of literal echoes. For example, the Latin decem iam annos eatatem trivi in Cicerone, echoed by the Greek one. Note. I've spent 10 years on Cicero. Ass. End note. Or musarum studia, Latin, described by the echo as dia, Greek. Note. The Muses' studies, divine ones. End note. Or Narcissus' rejection, Emoria, quam sit tibi copia nostri, to which echo responds, sit tibi copia nostri. Note. Narcissus, may I die before I give you power over me. Echo, I give you power over me. End note. On page 4, he even provides a woodcut from Athanasius Kircher's Neue Hall und Tonkunst, Nordlingen, 1684, illustrating an artificial echo machine designed to exchange clamore for 4 echoes, amore, more, ore, and finally, re. Note. O outcry returns as love, delays, hours, and king. End note. Nor does Hollander stop there. His slim volume abounds with examples of textual transfiguration, though in an effort to keep from repeating the entire book, let this heart-wrenching interchange serve as a final example. Chi dara fine al gran dolore? Lore. Note. Who will put an end to this great sadness? The hours passing. End note. While the figure of echo takes special delight in clever word games, Hollander knows better than to limit his examination there. Echo may live in metaphors, puns, and the suffix solis ex illo vivit in antris. Note. Literature's rocky caves. Subnote. From that time on she lived in lonely caves. Editors. End subnote. End note. But her range extends far beyond those literal walls. For instance, the rabbinical bat kol means daughter of a voice, which in modern Hebrew serves as a rough equivalent for the word echo. Milton knew it. God so commanded, and left the command sole daughter of his voice. Note. John Milton's Paradise Lost, 9, 653-54. End note. So did Wordsworth. Stern daughter of the voice of God. Quoting from Henry Reynold's Myth or Mystes, 1632, Hollander evidences religious appropriation of the ancient myth, page 16. This wind is, as the before-mentioned Iamblichus, by consent of his other fellow Kabbalists, says, the symbol of the breath of God, and echo, the reflection of this divine breath, or spirit upon us, or, as they interpret it, the daughter of the divine voice, which through the beatifying splendor it sheds and diffuses through the soul, is justly worthy to be reverenced and adored by us. This echo descending upon a Narcissus, or such a soul as, impurely and vitiously affected, slights and stops his ears to the divine voice, or shuts his heart from divine inspirations, through his being enamoured of not himself, but his own shadow merely, he becomes thence, an earthy, weak, worthless thing, and fit sacrifice for only eternal oblivion. Thus Echo suddenly assumes the role of God's messenger, a female Mercury, or perhaps even Prometheus, decked in talaria, with lamp in hand, descending on fortunate humanity. In 1989, however, the noted Southern theologian Hanson Edwin Rose dramatically revised this reading. In a series of lectures delivered at Chapel Hill, Rose referred to God's grand utterance as the biggest bang of them all, after discussing in depth the difference between the Hebrew davhar and the Greek logos. Rose took a careful accounting of St. John, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It was a virtuoso performance, but one that surely would have been relegated to those dusty shelves already burdened with 1,000 years of seminary discourse, had he not summed up his ruminations with this incendiary and still infamous conclusion. Look to the sky, look to yourself, and remember, we are only God's echoes, and God is Narcissus. Note: Hanson Edwin Rose, Creationist Myths, Detroit, Michigan, Pneuma Publications, 1989, page 219, endnote. Rose's pronouncement recalls another equally important meditation. Why did God create a dual universe? So he might say, be not like me, I am alone, and it might be heard. Note: these lines have a familiar ring, though I have no clue why or where I've heard them before. Subnote: though we were ultimately unsuccessful, all efforts were made to determine who wrote the above verse. We apologize for this inconsistency. Anyone who can provide legitimate proof of authorship will be credited in future editions. Editors. End subnote. End note. There is not time or room to adequately address the complexity inherent in this passage, aside from noting how the voice is returned, or figuratively echoed, not with an actual word, but with the mere understanding that it was received, listened to, or, as the text explicitly states, heard. What the passage occludes, no doubt on purpose, is how such an understanding might be attained. Interestingly enough, for all its marvelous observation, the figure of echo contains a startling error, one which performs a poetic modulation on a voice sounded over a century ago. While discussing Wordsworth's poem The Power of Sound, Hollander quotes on page 19 the following few lines. Ye voices and ye shadows, and images of voice, to hound and horn from rocky steep and rock-bestudded meadows, flung back, and in the sky's blue care reborn. Italics added for emphasis. Perhaps it is simply a typographical error committed by the publisher, or perhaps the publisher was dutifully transcribing an error committed by Hollander himself, not just a scholar, but a poet as well, who in that tiny slip where an R replaced a V and an S miraculously vanished, reveals his own relation to the meaning of echo, a meaning Wordsworth did not share. Consider the original text. Ye voices and ye shadows, and images of voice, to hound and horn from rocky steep and rock-bestudded meadows, flung back, and in the sky's blue caves reborn. Note: William Wordsworth, The Poems of William Wordsworth, ed. Nowell Charles Smith, M.A., Volume 1, London, Methuen & Co., 1908, page 395. Also of some interest is Alice May Williams' letter to the observers at Mount Wilson, CAT number 0005, in which she writes, I believe that sky opens and closes on certain periods, when you see all that cloud covering the sky right up and over. Those clouds are cold, blinds, shutters, and verandas. Sometimes that sky opens underneath. See, no one may ever have the same knowledge again. Letters to Mount Wilson Observatory, 1915 to 1935, edited and transcribed by Sarah Simons, West Covina, California, Society for the Diffusion of Useful Information Press, 1993, page 11, end note. Italics, added for emphasis. While Wordsworth poetics retain the literal properties and stay within the canonical jurisdiction of echo, Hollanders find something else. Not exactly religious, that would be hyperbole, but compassionate, which, as an echo of humanity, suggests the profoundest return of all. Aside from recurrence, revision, and commensurate symbolic reference, echoes also reveal emptiness. Since objects always muffle or impede acoustic reflection, only empty places can create echoes of lasting clarity. Ironically, hollowness only increases the eerie quality of otherness inherent in any echo. Delay and fragmented repetition create a sense of another inhabiting a necessarily deserted place. Strange, then, how something so uncanny and outside of the self, even ghostly, as some have suggested, can at the same time also contain a resilient comfort. The assurance that even if it is imaginary, and at best the product of a wall, there is still something else out there, something to stake out in the face of nothingness. Hollander is wrong when he writes on page 55. The apparent echoing of solitary words reminds us that acoustical echoing in empty places can be a very common auditory emblem, redolent of Gothic novels as it may be, of isolation and often of unwilling solitude. This is no doubt a case of natural echoes conforming to echo's mythographic mocking, rather than affirming, role. In an empty hall that should be comfortably inhabited, echoes of our voices and motions mock our very presence in the hollow space. It is not by accident that choirs singing psalms are most always recorded with ample reverb. Divinity seems defined by echo. Whether the Vienna Boys' Choir or monks chanting away on some chart-climbing CD, the hallowed always seems to abide in the province of the hollow. The reason for this is not too complex. An echo, while implying an enormity of a space, at the same time also defines it, limits it, and even temporarily inhabits it. When a pebble falls down a well, it is gratifying to hear the eventual plunk. If, however, the pebble only slips into darkness and vanishes without a sound, the effect is disquieting. In the case of a verbal echo, the spoken word acts as the pebble, and the subsequent repetition serves as the plunk. In this way, speaking can result in a form of seeing. For all its merits, Hollander's book only devotes 5 pages to the actual physics of sound. While this is not the place to dwell on the beautiful and complex properties of reflection, in order to even dimly comprehend the shape of the Navidson house, it is still critical to recognize how the laws of physics, in tandem with echo's mythic inheritance, serve to enhance echo's interpretive strength. The descriptive ability of the audible is easily designated with the following formula. Sound plus time equals acoustic light. As most people know who are versed in this century's technological effects, exact distances can be determined by timing the duration of a sound's round trip between the deflecting object and its point of origin. This principle serves as the basis for all the radar, sonar, and ultrasonics used every day around the world by air traffic controllers, fishermen, and obstetricians. By using sound or electromagnetic waves, visible blips may be produced on a screen, indicating either a 747, a school of salmon, or the barely pumping heart of a fetus. Of course, echolocation has certainly never belonged exclusively to technology. Microchiroptera, bats, cetacean, porpoises and toothed whales, delphis, dolphins, as well as certain mammals, flying foxes, and birds, oil birds, all use sound to create extremely accurate acoustic images. However, unlike their human counterparts, neither bats nor dolphins require an intermediary screen to interpret the echoes. They simply see the shape of sound. Bats, for example, create frequency-modulated, FM, images by producing constant frequency signals, 0.5 to 100 plus ms, and FM signals, 0.5 to 10 ms in their larynx. The respondent echoes are then translated into nerve discharges in the auditory cortex, enabling the bat not only to determine an insect's velocity and direction through synaptic interpretation of Doppler shifts, but pinpoint its location to within a fraction of a millimeter. Note: see D.R. Griffin, Listening in the Dark, 1986. End note. As Michael J. Buckingham noted in the mid-80s, imaging performed by the human eye is neither active nor passive. The eye does not need to produce a signal to see, nor does an object have to produce a signal in order to be seen. An object merely needs to be illuminated. Based on these observations, the already mentioned formula reflects a more accurate understanding of vision with the following refinement. Sound plus time equals acoustic touch. As Gloucester murmured, I see it feelingly. Note: King Lear, Act 4, Scene 6, line 147. End note. Unfortunately, humans lack the sophisticated neural hardware present in bats and whales. The blind must rely on the feeble light of fingertips and the painful shape of a cracked shin. Echolocation comes down to the crude assessment of simple sound modulations, whether in the dull reply of a tapping cane or the low, eerie flutter in one simple word, perhaps your word, flung down empty hallways, long past midnight. Note: you don't need me to point out the intensely personal nature of this passage. Frankly, I'd have wrecked a quick skip past the whole echo ramble were it not for those 6 lines, especially the last bit, perhaps your word, conjuring up, at least for me, one of those deep piercing reactions, the kind that just misses a ventricle, the old man making his way, feeling his way, around the walls of another evening. A slow and tedious progress, but one which begins to yield, somehow, the story of his own creature darkness, taking me completely by surprise. A sudden charge from out of the dullest moment, jaws lunging open, claws protracting. And just so you understand where I'm coming from, I consider long past midnight one claw, and empty hallways another. Don't worry, Lou didn't buy it either, but at least he bought a couple of rounds. 2 nights ago, we were checking out the Sky Bar, hemorrhaging dough on drinks, but Lou could only cough hard and then laugh real coronary-like. Hoss, a claw is made of bone just like a stilt's made of steel. Sure, I said. But it was loud there, and the crowd kept both of us from hearing correctly, and while I wanted to believe Lude's basics, I couldn't. There was something just so awful in the old man's utterance. I felt a terrible empathy for him then, living in that tiny place, permeated with the odor of age, useless blinks against the darkness. His word, my word, maybe even your word, added to this, and ringing inside me like some awful dream, over and over again, modulating slightly, slowly pitching my own defenses into something entirely different, until the music of that recurrence drew into relief my own scars drawn long ago, over 2 decades ago, and with more than a claw, a stiletto, or even an ancient Samuel O'Reilly at 1891. And these scars, torn, ripped, bleeding, and stuttering, for they are first of all his scars, the kind only bars of an EKG can accurately remember, a more precise, if incomplete history, Q waves deflecting downward at what must be considered the commencement of the QRS complex, telling the story of a past infarction, that awful endurance and eventual letting go, the failure which began it all in the first place, probably right after one burning maze, but still years ahead of the other loss, a horrible violence, before the coming of that great whale, before the final drift, nod, macking, skid, twist and topple, his own burning, years before the long rest, coming along in its own way, its own nightmare, perhaps even in the folds of another unprotected sleep, so I like to imagine. Silvering wings fragmenting, then scattering like fish scales flung on the jet stream, above the clouds and every epic venture still suggested in those delicate, light-cradled borders. Other lands, sweeping the world like a whisper, a hand, even if salmon scales still slip through words as easily as palmed prisms of salt will always slip through fingers, shimmering, raining, confused, and no matter how spectacular, forever unable to prevent his fall, down through the silver, the salmon, away from the gold and the myriad of games held in just that word, suggesting it might have even been Spanish gold, though this makes no difference. Still tumbling in dying and embered, even, or never, in a different light, and not waking this time before the hit, but sleeping right through it, the slamming into the ground at terminal velocity too, the pound, the bounce. What kind of ground air emergency code would that mark mean? The opposition of L's, not understood. Probably just X marks the spot, unable to proceed. Then, in the awful second arc and second descent, after the sound, the realization of what sleep has just now delivered. That bloody handmaiden, this time her toiling fingers wet with boiling deformation, oozing in the mutilations of birth, heartless and unholy, black with afterbirth, miscreated changeling and foul, what no one beside him could prevent, but rather might have even caused, and mine too. This unread trauma, driving him to consciousness with a scream, not even a word, a scream, and even that never heard. So not a scream, but the clutch of life held by will alone. No 9/11, no call at all, just his own misunderstanding of the reality that had broken into the hall. The silence then of a woman and an only son, describing in an agonizing hour all it takes to let go, broken, bleeding, ragged, twisted, savaged, torn and dying too, so permanently wronged, though for how many years, gone, untold, unseen, reminiscent of another silver shape. So removed and yet so dear, kept on a cold gold chain, years on, this fistful of twitching injured life, finally recovering on its own until eventually, like a seed conceived, born and grown, the story of its injured beat survives long enough to destroy and devour, by the simple telling of its fall, all his hope, his home, his only love, the very color of his flesh, and the dark marrow of his bone. "Are you okay, Truant?" Lude asked. But I saw a strange glimmer everywhere, confined to the sharp oscillations of yellow and blue, as if my retinal view suddenly included, along with the reflective blessings of light, an unearthly collusion with scent and sound, registering all possibilities of harm, every threat, every move, even with all that grinning and meeting and din. 1,001 possible claws. Of course, Lou didn't see it. He was blind, maybe even right. We drove down Sunset and soon veered south into the flats. A party somewhere, an important gathering of E-heads and cokeheads. Lude would never feel how empty hallways long past midnight could slice inside of you, though I'm not so sure he wasn't sliced up just the same. Not seeing the rip doesn't mean you automatically get to keep clear of the, hey, I'm bleeding part. To feel, though, you have to care, and as we walked out into the blue-lit patio and discovered a motorcycle spluttering up oil and bubbles from the bottom of the pool, while on the diving board 2 men shoved flakes of ice up a woman's bleeding nostrils, her shirt off, her bra nearly transparent, I knew Lude would never care much about the dead. And maybe he was right. Maybe some things are best left untouched. Of course, he didn't know the dead like I did. And so when he absconded with a bottle of Jack from the kitchen, I did my best to join him, obliterate my own cavities and graves. But come morning, despite my headache and the vomit on my shirt, I knew I'd failed. Inside me, a long dark hallway already caressed the other music of a single word. And what's worse, despite the amazements of chemicals, continued to grow. End note. The study of architectural acoustics focuses on the rich interplay between sound and interior design. Consider, for example, how an enclosed space will naturally increase sound pressure and raise the frequency, even though they are usually difficult to calculate. Resonance frequencies, also known as eigenfrequencies or natural frequencies, can be easily determined for a perfectly rectangular room with hard, smooth walls. The following formula describes the resonance frequencies, F, in a room with a length of L, width of W, and height of H, where the velocity of sound equals c. F equals c over 2 times, brackets, n over L squared plus m over W squared plus P over H squared, close brackets, 1 over 2 hertz. Note that if L, W, and H all equal infinity, F will equal 0. Along with resonance frequencies, the study of sound also takes into account wave acoustics, ray acoustics, diffusion, and steady-state pressure levels, as well as sound absorption and transmission through walls. A careful examination of the dynamics involved in sound absorption reveals how incident sound waves are converted to energy. In the case of porous material, the subsurface lattice of interstices translates sound waves into heat. Nevertheless, above and beyond the details of frequency shifts and volume fluctuations, the physics of otherness, what matters most is a sound's delay. Note: further attention should probably be given to Sabins and transmission loss as described by TL equals 10 log 1 over T dB, where T equals a transmission coefficient and a high TL indicates a high sound insulation. Unfortunately, one could write several lengthy books on sound alone in the Navidson record. Oddly enough, with the sole exception of Kellogg-Pequot's article on acoustic impedance in Navidson's house, Science, April 1995, page 43, nothing else has been rendered on this particularly resonant topic. On the subject of acoustic coefficients, however, see Ned Noyes' Echo's Verse in Science News, volume 143, February 6, 1993, page 85. End note. Point of fact: the human ear cannot distinguish one sound wave from the same sound wave if it returns in less than 50 milliseconds. Therefore, for anyone to hear a reverberation requires a certain amount of space. At 68 degrees Fahrenheit, sound travels at approximately 1,130 feet per second. A reflective surface must stand at least 56.5 feet away in order for a person to detect the doubling of her voice. Note: parallel surfaces will create a flutter echo, though frequently a splay of as little as 60 millimeters, 5/8 of an inch, can prevent the multiple repetitions. End note. In other words, to hear an echo, regardless of whether eyes are open or closed, is to have already seen a sizable place. Myth makes echo the subject of longing and desire. Physics makes echo the subject of distance and design. Where emotion and reason are concerned, both claims are accurate. And where there is no echo, there is no description of space or love. There is only silence. Note: there is something more at work here, some sort of antithetical reasoning and proof-making. And what about light? All of which actually made sense to me at a certain hour before midnight, or at least came close to making sense. Problem was, Lude interrupted my thoughts when he came over, and after much discussion, not to mention shots of tequila and a nice haircut, convinced me to share a bag of mushrooms with him. And in spite of getting violently ill in the aisle of a certain 7-Eleven, me, not him, led me to an after-hours party where I soon became engrossed in a green-eyed brunette, Lucy, who had no intention of letting our dance end at the club. And yet even in our sheet-twisting, lightless dance on my floor, her own features, those pale legs, soft arms, the fragile collarbone tracing a shadow of, can't write the word, invariably became entwined and permanently entangled, even entirely replaced by images of a completely different woman, relatively new, or not new at all, but for reasons unknown to me, still continuing to endure as a center to my thoughts. Her first encountered in the company of Lude and my boss at a place my boss likes to call the Ghost. The problem is that in his mind, the ghost actually refers to two places, the Garden of Eden on La Brea and the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset. How or why this came about is impossible to trace. Private nomenclature seems to rapidly develop in tight, set-upon circles, though truth be told, we were only set upon on a good day, and tight here should be taken pretty loosely. How then, you ask, do you know what's being referred to when the ghost gets mentioned? You don't. You just end up at one or the other, often the rainbow, though not always the rainbow. You see, how my boss defines the ghost varies from day to day, depending mostly on his moods and appetites. Consequently, the previously mentioned pretty loosely should probably be struck and restated as very, very loosely. Anyway, what I'm about to tell you happened on one of those rare evenings when we actually all got together. My boss was chattering incessantly about his junk days in London and how he'd contemplated sobriety, and what those contemplations had been like. Eventually, he detoured into long-winded non-stories about his art school experiences in Detroit. Lots of, hey, my thing for that whole time thing was really a kind of art thing or something, which was about when I hauled out my pad of sketches, because no matter what you made of his BS, you still couldn't fault him for his work. He was one of best, and every tatted local knew it. Truth be known, I'd been waiting for this chance for a while, keen on getting his out-of-the-shot perspective on my efforts. And what efforts they were. Diligent designs sketched over the months, intended someday to live in skin, each image carefully wrapped and coiled in colours of cinnabar, lemon, celadon, and indigo, incarnated in the scales of dragons, the bark of ancient roods, shields welded by generations cast aside in the oily umber of shadow and blood, not to speak of lifeless trees prevailing against indifferent skies, or colossal vessels asleep in prehistoric sediment, miles beneath even the faintest suggestion of light. At least that's how I would describe them, every one meticulously rendered on tracing paper, cracking like fire whenever touched. A multitude of pages, which my boss briefly examined before handing them back to me. "Take up typing," he grunted. Well, that's nice, I thought. At least the next step was clear. Some act of violence would be necessary. And so it was that before another synapse could fire within my bad-off labyrinthine brain, he was already lying on the floor. Or, I should say, his mangled body was lying on the floor. His head remained in my hands, twisted off like a cap. Not as difficult as I'd imagined. The first turn, definitely the toughest, necessitating the breaking of cervical vertebrae and the snapping of the spinal cord. But after that, another 6 or so turns, and voila, the head was off. Nothing could be easier. Time to go bowling. My boss smiled, said hello. But he wasn't smiling or saying hello to me. Somehow, she was already standing there, right in front of him, right in front of me, talking to him, reminiscing, touching his shoulder, even winking at me in lewd. Wow. Out of nowhere. Out of the blue. Where had she come from? Or for that matter, when? Of course, my boss didn't introduce her. He just left me to gape. I couldn't even imagine twisting off his head for a second time, as that would have meant losing sight of her, which I found myself quite unwilling to do. Fortunately, after that evening, she began dropping by that shop a lot, always wearing these daisy sunglasses, and each time taking me completely off guard. She still drives me nuts. Just thinking of her now, and I'm lost. Lost in the smell of her, the way of her, and everything she conjures up inside me. A mad rush of folly and oddly muted lusts, sensations sublimated faster than I can follow, into, oh hell, I don't know what into. I probably shouldn't even be using a word like sublimate. But that's beside the point. her hair reminding me of a shiny gold desert wind braised in a hot August sun, hips curving like coastal norths, tits rising and falling beneath her blue sweatshirt, the way an ocean will do long after the storm has passed. She's always a little out of breath when she climbs the flight of stairs leading up to the shop. One glance at her, even now in the glass of my mind, and I want to take off, travel with her. Who knows where, either. Somewhere. My desire, suddenly informed by something deeper, even unknown, pouring into me, drawn off some peculiar reserve, tracing thoughts of the drive she and I would take, lungs full of that pine-rasping air, outracing something unpleasant, something burning. In fact, the entire coast, along with tens of thousands of acres of inland forest, is burning. But we're leaving. We're getting away. We're free. Our hands battered by the clutch of holding on. I don't know what to, but holding just the same. And cheeks streaked with wind tears. And now that I think of it, I guess we are on a motorcycle. A triumph? Isn't that what Lude always talks about buying? Ascending into colder but brighter climes? And I don't know anything about bikes, let alone how to drive one. And there I go again. She does that to me. Like I already said, drives me nuts. Hello? That was the first word she ever said to me in the shop. Not like hi either, more like, hello, is anyone home? Hence the question mark. I wasn't even looking at her when she said it, just staring blankly down at my equally blank pad of tracing paper, probably thinking something similar to all those ridiculous sappy thoughts I just now recounted, about road trips and forest fires and motorcycles, remembering her even though she was right there in front of me, only a few feet away. Hey, asshole, my boss shouted. Hang up her fucking pants. What's the matter with you? Something would have to be done about him. But before I could hurl him through the plate glass window into the traffic below, she smiled and handed me her bright pink flip-flops and white Adidas sweats. My boss was lucky. This magnificent creature had just saved his life. Gratefully I received her clothes, lifting them from her fingertips like they were some sacred vesture bestowed upon me by the Virgin Mary herself. The hard part, I found, was trying not to stare too long at her legs. Very tricky to do. Next to impossible, especially with her just standing there in a black G-string, her bare feet sweating on the naked floor. I did my best to smile in a way that would conceal my awe. Thank you, I said, thinking I should kneel. Thank you, she insisted. Those were the next two words she ever said to me, and wow, I don't know why, but her voice went off in my head like a symphony. A great symphony. A sweet symphony. A great fucking sweet symphony. I don't know what I'm saying. I know absolutely shit about symphonies. What's your name? The total suddenly climbing to an impossible 6 words. Johnny, I mumbled, promptly earning 4 more words. And just like that. Nice to meet you, she said, in a way that almost sounded like a psalm. And then, even though she clearly enjoyed the effect she was having on me, she turned away with a wink, leaving me to ponder and perhaps pray. At least I had her 10 words. Hello, thank you, what's your name, nice to meet you. 10 whole fucking words. Wow. Wow, wow. And hard as this may be for you to believe, I really was reeling. Even after she left the shop an hour or so later, I was still giving serious thought to petitioning all major religions in order to have her deified. In fact, I was so caught up in the thought of her, there was even a moment where I failed to recognize my boss. I had absolutely no clue who he was. I just stared at him, thinking to myself, who's this dumb mutant, and how the hell did he get up here? Which, it turns out, I didn't think at all, but accidentally said out loud, causing all sorts of mayhem to ensue. not worth delving into now. Quick note here. If this crush/swooning stuff is hard for you to stomach, if you've never had a similar experience, then you should come to grips with the fact that you've got a TV dinner for a heart and might want to consider climbing inside a microwave and turning it on high for at least an hour, which, if you do consider, only goes to show what kind of idiot you truly are, because microwaves are way too small for anyone, let alone you, to climb into. Quick second note, if that last paragraph didn't apply to you, you may skip it and proceed to this next part. As for her real name, I still don't know it. She's a stripper at some place near the airport. She has a dozen names. The first time she came into the shop, she wanted one of her tattoos retouched. "Just an inch away from my perfectly shaved pussy," she announced, very matter-of-factly, only to add somewhat coyly, slipping 2 fingers beneath her G-string and pulling it aside. No need to wink now. The happiest place on earth. Suffice it to say, the second I saw that rabbit, the second I started calling her Thumper. I do admit it seems a little strange, even to me, to realize that even after 4 months I'm still swept up in her. Lou sure as hell doesn't understand it. One, because I've fallen for a stripper. Fucka and fall for have very different meanings, us. The first one you do as much as you can. The second one you never, ever, ever do. And 2, because she's older than me. If you're going to reel for a stripper, he advises, you should at least reel for a young one. They're sexier and not as bent. Which is true. She does have a good 6 years on me. But what can I say? I'm taken. I love how enthralled she remains by this festival of living, nothing reserved or even remotely ashamed about who she is or what she does. Always talking blue streak to my boss about her 3-year-old child, her boyfriend, her boyfriends, the hand jobs she gets extra for, 11 years of sobriety. Her words always winding up the way it feels to wake up wide awake. Everything about her awakening at every moment, alive to the world and its quirky opportunities. A sudden rite of spring. Thumper's spring, though spring's already sprung. Rabbit, rabbit. And now April's ruling, April's looming, April's fooling around in yet another round for this year's ruling April Fool. Yeah, I know. This shit's getting ridiculous. Even worse, I feel like I could continue in that vein for years, maybe even decades. And yet, listen to this. To date, I've hardly said a word to her. Don't have a decent explanation for my silence either. Maybe it's my boss and his guard dog glare. Maybe it's her. I suspect it's her. Every time she visits, though I admit there haven't been that many visits, she overwhelms me. It doesn't matter that she always gives me a wink and sometimes even a full-throated laugh when I call her Thumper, hi Thumper, bye Thumper, the only words I can really muster. She still really only exists for me as a strange mixture of daydream and present-day edge, by which I mean something without a past or a future, an icon or idol of sorts, for some reason forbidden to me, but seductive beyond belief and probably relief. Her image feeling permanently fixed within me, but not new. More like it's been there all along, even if I know that's not true. And come last night, going so far as to entwine, entangle, and finally completely replace her with the, can't write the word, of Thumper's flashing eyes, her aching lips, her heart-ending moans, those I had imagined. An ongoing list, so minute and distracting that long after, when the sheets were gathered, wet with sex, cold with rest, I did not know who lay beside me. And seeing the stranger, the vessel of my dreams, I withdrew to the toilet, to the shower, to my table, enough racket and detachment to communicate an unfair request. But poor her, she heard it, and without a word, dressed, and without a smile, requested a brush, and without a kiss, left, leaving me alone to return to this passage where I discovered the beginnings of a sense long since taken and strewn, leading me away on what I guess amounts to another hopeless digression. Perhaps when I'm finished, I'll remember what I'd hoped to say in the first place. Subnote. Mr. Truant declined to comment further on this particular passage. Editors. End subnote. End